came to talk about a topic that's near and dear to my heart. In a way, CodeStream is the ultimate scratch-your-own-itch story, and I want to talk mostly not about the product, but about what led us to build it. A problem that we all face, which is making it easier to talk about code and capturing that institutional knowledge, because I think that's underappreciated in the software development process. I think software engineering, perhaps more than any other industry, relies on you having institutional knowledge about your work product. It's incredibly difficult to understand code that you're unfamiliar with. I'm going to keep coming back to that theme during the course of the talk. So if you're the type of person that can look at a piece of code, instantly recognize, know exactly how it works and everything about it, then this talk is not for you, and you can go join one of the other tracks. But if you're a human being who takes time to understand code, then hopefully we'll have a couple of nuggets of information for you. So I just wanted to start with a very brief background about me and the team. I'll keep it brief, I promise. I had the really good fortune of working with the same group of guys for 23 years. CodeStream is actually our 4th startup together. I have a slightly funny story for those of you who are similar in age to me. We just went through Y Combinator, which if you're not familiar with, it's this incubator program where most of the kids that, and I say kids, that have participated in are like 22, 23. So we had a version of this slide for our demo day pitch, but we lied and we said 10 years together because I didn't want to seem that old. All right, so who am I? Well, not so much me, but us. So the relevant parts of our history is we've been building building companies around real-time messaging for over 20 years. So we feel that we understand that space very, very well. And sort of separately, I'm the CEO, but I'm also a developer. I write code every single day. So this is why I say this is the ultimate scratch-your-own-itch story, because here we're talking about institutional knowledge, improving workflow around communication for developers. So this is like the merging of my 2 big passions in life. In doing so, we aim to solve what's perhaps the single most painful part of software development, which is communication. So we're going to dive into this problem and peel back the onion a bit and try to look at all the different ways that communication is difficult and underutilized within software engineering. So today, I'm sure this speaks to almost everybody in the room, every development team tracks every change to every line of every file in your whole source tree, all the way back to the beginning of time, using Git. Most of us are using Git, some other source control systems. But we all take such great care around all the changes to our source tree. And yet those same teams are taking all the discussion around that code, which in many ways explains how it all works. Every question asked, every discussion, every suggestion. And we essentially just throw it away in either Slack or Gmail or whatever you're using for communication, because those tools are not linked in any way to your source tree. It's kind of crazy if you think about it. Another way to look at this is that we treat our source code like gold, and yet we treat our discussion around source code like garbage. And the more that we thought about this, the more we realized just how bad of a problem this is for developers. It's kind of like I use the cobbler's son always has the worst shoes, or the barber always has the worst haircut in town. Why is it the software engineers haven't solved this problem for ourselves? If you think about the way that Google Docs works, it's super easy to communicate about a document in Google Docs. You just select the text and add a comment. And yet for developers, if you're looking at a piece of code, it's not that easy at all. So let's dive in. So what I would argue is one of the most common, if not the most common occurrence for developers is you're looking through code that you're not familiar with. Let's say, for example, this code here on the left. So I wanted to take a quick poll. Raise your hand if you have understood every single block of code you've ever seen in your life. 0 hands, good. So this is a pain that every developer knows very well. Happens every day, 100 times, 1,000 times a day across all your development teams. And it's a natural outcome, 100% natural outcome of the way we work. In fact, if you haven't seen this next cartoon, it's pretty funny. WTFs per minute as a measure of code quality. Now I think the funny part, this is just a funny cartoon, but the really funny part is that even good code has a number of WTFs. Just means people don't understand what they're looking at, right? It's hard to grok code. We even have a special word for it. That word grok was invented for computer scientists to talk about the challenge of understanding code. So that's the problem, is understanding code. But there's an even bigger problem, that developers aren't discussing code nearly as often as they could or should. And our recent experience at Y Combinator gave us the opportunity to talk to 1,000 different software engineering teams, each one individually, and we discovered two basic things. Number one, that developers don't talk about code nearly enough. And when they do, it's rarely preserved in any meaningful way for the future. And number two is that the two basic foundations for building institutional knowledge is to create it in the first place and then to preserve it. So this led to another big question that we had. Why are code discussions so rare? Why is it so rare that we actually talk to each other about source code? So we took a hard look at the question and found what we think are the top 3 reasons why. So reason number 1 is that most companies we spoke with use some variation of an agile process, whatever they call it. Work is divided up during some form of a planning meeting early in the week, typically. But then during the week, once you're assigned your tasks, most developers are heads down working on code with very little interaction with their peers. And then at the end of the sprint, whether it's a week or 2 weeks or whatever your cadence is, you come up, it's code review time, and you share your work product with the rest of your team. And if you've got a good team process, you probably have some sort of code review where everybody looks at it and comments on it. But let's say you're the team lead, and your responsibility is for the overall code quality. You're often faced, I'm sure many of you have faced this many times, you're faced with an unenviable decision to make at the end of that sprint, which is if somebody's work is subpar, but it passes QA, you're forced to decide, do I ask that developer to go back and fix it and do it the right way, in which case we have to slip the schedule, or do I accept this code into the code base and merge it, and now I know there's additional technical debt. We've just made the code base a lot messier, and we're going to have to go back and clean it up in the future. We'll talk about how to avoid this. The second reason, and it's just one of culture. This is something that may be changing slowly, but certainly for most of my career, this is the biggest issue. We've all heard about and relate to the concept of this rock star coder, the guy that always knows everything. It's an independent problem-solving culture, and it's great for individual contributors and contributions, but it's not good for team-based work, which is most of what we do. In fact, in Stack Overflow's most recent survey, 40% of new developers describe themselves as competing with their peers, not collaborating with, but competing. And that doesn't dissipate until you're in the industry for 5 full years. So all these new kids out of college are still trying to one-up each other. And in our interviews, when we talk to developers, especially newer ones, they tend to avoid asking questions, even if those questions are perfectly valid. They're just too embarrassed to ask. So it's really that cultural problem. And number 3, and this is the big one, this is the biggest reason that we found, is that we're just using the wrong tools to collaborate around code. My favorite example is this development team who used, and I'm not making this up, they took pictures of their monitor and sent it to each other via Facebook Messenger. And that's how they collaborated on code. And so that really underscores that something's missing. Of all of these tools that developers use that we've spoken with, none of them know what code is. None of them are aware of your code base. We don't yet have the tools to make this easy. So all of this results in a pretty tragic statistic, which is that according to Stack Overflow's survey, fewer than 20% of developers who are trying to learn about a code base do so through any form of documentation provided by the company whose code base it is. So more than 4 out of 5 developers have to find some other way to do it. So let's go back to this original problem. And let's say you're looking at a piece of code that you don't understand and you actually want to ask a question. You want to ask for your team, how does this work? WTF? Explain it to me. This is probably the simplest form of communication you can think of. The simplest example. I'm looking at code, I just want to ask a question. We found that in the companies we spoke to, the 3 most common ways to exchange information about code are number 1, inline comments, number 2, using GitHub, and number 3, using Slack in increasing order of frequency. So inline is the least, GitHub, and then Slack. And each one of these has a problem. Well, for inline comments, you can't have a conversation. You can't ask a question. So you can document how something's supposed to work, and then you have to worry about keeping it in sync. But you can't ask somebody to explain something to you with an inline comment. GitHub pull request comments are actually pretty good, but they only let you talk about the deltas to your code, so only the changes. So at the end of a sprint, what changed, you can talk about that, but what about the rest of your code base? If you manage any sort of sizable code base, let's say you've got 5 million lines of code in your code base, there are perhaps 500 that changed that week. Well, what about the other 4.999 million lines of code? What if you have a question about that? And Slack is what most of us are using today to talk about code. And it's got a number of problems, which I'm going to step through in a second. But the biggest one is that it's ephemeral. Very quickly, all of those conversations will disappear. So let's pick on Slack a little bit. And I will say, for the record, I love Slack. I use it every day. It's a great product. Developers love Slack, and for good reason. It does make a lot of things really easy to talk about. But if you've ever tried to talk about code within Slack, you may be familiar with some of these steps. The reason that it's so difficult to talk about code in Slack is Slack doesn't know anything about your code base. So if you just want to ask a question about a function that you're looking at, you have to resort to copying and pasting. But that's not nearly enough because you have to describe the context of what you were looking at. So what was the repo I was in? What was the file? What was the path to the file? What part of the file? What branch was I on? And if you want to ask the right person, then you have to go shift and go to Git and do a Git blame and find out who it was that wrote that code. So you can go mention the right person on Slack. So if you write out all those steps, it's actually a lot harder than you think. And it turns out to be 18 or so different things that you have to do. Just ask a simple question. And let's say you were willing to do that. Let's say you're jumping through those 18 hoops isn't too much work for you, which, by the way, you have to do every single time you have a question. And you get an answer. Think about what just happened. You have something in your code that's so unclear that you're willing to jump through hoops to get the answer to it. Somebody answers your question. Well, now that question and that answer live in this other system that's completely separate from your code base and quickly scrolls off the page. So the existing tools, I hope I've convinced you by now, aren't sufficient to make it easy to talk about code. So that's number 1. And then the second part of this is why does it matter? Why does it matter that we retain knowledge with software engineering? And it boils down to really four issues. So I'll walk you through all 4. So the first thing is our never-ending war with technical debt. We talked about this a little bit before. But like death and taxes, it's always going to be there. The problem of technical debt is often made worse by difficulty of communicating and the lack of institutional knowledge about how our code base works. And we all have a vested interest in making this problem easier to manage. And I'd like to share with you a personal story that happened a couple years ago where one of the developers on the team submitted a new feature branch for a pull request for a feature branch. He wrote some new code. And the spec was pretty unspecific in terms of how to implement the solution. But we basically said there's this page in the product that looks like this. We want to make another one, make it use the same widgets and the same styling, and just make it do this. And so developer faithfully implemented the new feature. It looked the same, it worked the same, everything looked great. Passed QA, PM was happy, and we were about to merge it in when we realized that he had created an entirely parallel implementation of those two pages. So they had like HTML widgets that were drop downs, and he just rewrote all of them. So now, what are we to do? Do we have to go back and ask him to go redo the whole thing, start from scratch? And these are the problems that you face when dealing with this issue of managing technical debt. So the second part is onboarding, second big reason. So Stack Overflow's latest developer survey asked people how quickly they expected new developers to come up to speed. And 3/4 of all respondents said that 3 months was the time expected, less than 3 months to come up to speed and contribute. And 30% of respondents said they wanted their developers to be up to speed in less than a month. Now, if you've ever worked on a big, sizable project, you know that that can be a challenge. And one of the biggest parts of that challenge is when you're on a deadline. Because the frequent and obvious response to, hey, we're late with this project, is to add more resources. But we all know that that often has the opposite effect. That by adding new resources late in a project cycle, that puts a drain on the productivity of the team, and you end up actually going backwards. Because often it's too long to get somebody to be a positive contributor. In the short term, they're actually a negative contributor. So the third reason is turnover. Institutional knowledge matters because that rock star you hired, who's been such a great contributor over the last couple of years, is eventually going to leave your team. And in fact, in software engineering, it's becoming an increasingly important problem to deal with because the average time between job changes is shrinking. There was a report done by Radford that found that software leads all industries with a turnover rate approaching 25%. And in the Stack Overflow survey, 56% of developers have changed jobs within the last 2 years. And the median tenure is only 2 years for software engineers, and it's even worse at smaller companies with a median tenure of only 1.5 years. So when you hire somebody, you think you got this great new hire, chances are you only keep that employee for 18 months. So think about how that relates to the challenge of onboarding. If you're only going to have them on your team for 18 months and it takes you 4 or 5 months just to turn them into a positive contributor, you only actually get positive contributions for a little over a year. So it becomes all the more important to capture as much institutional knowledge as possible while that employee is working for you. So when they inevitably do leave, at least you've retained as much information as possible. So the last reason that capturing institutional knowledge is important is because you can't always just reach over and tap somebody on the shoulder. Increasingly, we're becoming a remote workforce. In fact, a number of surveys has been done on this topic, and one of the interesting ones found that not offering remote working is now the #1 reason that people quit their job. And the #1 and #3 reasons that people accept new jobs or are looking for new jobs are related to flexibility of remote working, either full-time remote or being able to work part-time remote. And this last stat, 79% of knowledge workers do at least some work remotely. And over half of us work regularly from home. So all of this is important information about addressing a problem that's staring us in the face. It's the elephant in the room that we're all aware of, and yet nobody's done anything about it. And this is why I talk about this being the ultimate scratch your own itch story, because when we finally realized how all these pieces fit together, this is what gave us the motivation to create CodeStream. So what are the steps in order to solve these problems? Well, it's really a pretty simple process. 2 steps, that's it. #1 is we're going to make it easy to talk about code. When something is easier, it happens more often. And we've all seen this in different aspects of our life. If you forgive a kind of analogy here, if you can think all the way back to 2004, 2005, that time frame, none of us knew that we wanted to share pictures of our lunch with our friends, right? None of us did that. We all could do that because we all owned digital cameras back then, and we all had email accounts, so technically you could take a picture of your lunch, you could load it on your laptop or your desktop, and you could email it. But none of us did it because it was too difficult, too many steps. Hopefully this reminds you of the too many steps of Slack. Now, we all have cameras in our pockets, and they're all connected to social networks, so we take pictures and share all kinds of things all the time. And the only difference is it's easier. So making it easier can have profound effects on how often something happens. So imagine a world where it was super easy to talk about code. So what if it was just 2 steps instead of those 18? What if you could just select the code you're talking about and type your question? Now, we're all very familiar with this model. In fact, I already mentioned it before. If you've used Google Docs, you know how easy that is, right? All you do is select the sentence you want to talk about, and you click Add Comment. What if Google took that away? What if Google said, no, we don't want to offer that feature anymore, and in order to collaborate on a document, you had to write an email or something. You're looking at the document, open up an email, figure out who it's going to be to, and then copy and paste the URL to the Google Doc, and then copy and paste the sentence you want to change, and then you write out, hey, Dave and George, on page 3, the 4th paragraph. It sounds ridiculous, right? And yet that's what we as software engineers have to do every single day when we're talking about code on Slack. So let's make it easier. And the second thing we need to do is we need to save those conversations, because those are valuable conversations. And rather than throwing away in the garbage bin, what if we treated those with the same care that we treated our code base with? Well, we've already seen what happens when you use Slack or email or other solutions. They get lost in the stream forever, and you'll never see those comments again. But what if we could save those threads forever linked to the code that they refer to? What if all of those chats that you have, what if all of those conversations that you have, all those discussions where you decided why to change the constant from 60 seconds to 120 seconds and what problem that was going to solve? What if we could capture all of that and tie it forever to the code they referred to, so that the future you, who looks back at the code 6 months from now or a year from now, could be instantly reminded why that change was made? So with that, I'm going to switch gears and show you a demo of what we built. So here, I'm looking at an editor called Atom. Everybody familiar with Atom? I bet all of you have tried it. I bet hardly any of you are using it anymore. You've all switched to VS Code, right? And if you haven't, you probably will soon. You should check out VS Code. It's pretty great. When we first started building, so side digression here, when we first started building CodeStream, we were like, okay, what editor should we start with? Oh, Atom's most hackable editor. Let's start with that one. And this was like 9 months ago or something. And there were so many people using Atom, we thought it would be the great first choice. But between then and now, we went through Y Combinator, and I've talked to over 1,000 different development teams. And there's one of them out of the 1,000 where the whole team is using Atom. So it's everybody shifted to VS Code. So perhaps unsurprisingly, we got a version for VS Code coming out soon. Okay, but today we have Atom. So let me show you how it works. As per a typical IDE, I've got my project here on the left where I'm looking at a particular Git repo, and I've got a file in the middle, which is the file I'm editing. So the way that CodeStream works is just by an editor plugin. So you don't have to switch editors. Keep using the editor that you love, as long as it's Atom or VS Code. We'll build more later. And you just turn it on. You install it like any other plugin, and then just turn it on with a hotkey. You can hide it when you don't want it there as well. So it looks and works just like a chat stream. So if you're familiar with how Slack works or HipChat works, it works just the same. So you can talk to your teammates. You can mention them. You can share files. You can share links, all those features. The people who were who can see this chat stream are exactly the same people who see this repository, because we tie the chat to the repo so that you can talk about your code. If there are people on your team who don't want to use CodeStream, that's cool, because we have both a Slack integration and also bidirectional, and that works both ways. So you post in CodeStream, it posts to Slack, and they can reply in Slack, and it comes back to CodeStream. Same with email. So if you don't use Slack and you prefer email, we'll send an email out, and they can reply to the email, it comes back in. Same with Microsoft Teams. More support coming soon. So why would we want to use this instead of Slack or email? Well, hopefully by now you can guess where this demo is going. We're going to make it super easy to talk about code. So let's say I have a question about this particular function called turn-off tracking. And I want to ask the team. Well, all I have to do is select the code, hit a key, and I can type my question. Now, you can see here, so my name is Peter Pezaris, so that's my post. You can see that everybody will know exactly what I'm talking about because we include the code block as an attachment to the message. And you'll also notice that, if you can see this in the back, Colin Stryker's name was automatically @mentioned. Now, why did CodeStream @mention Colin Stryker? Well, it's because CodeStream did the git lookup and found out that it was Colin who wrote that code. So if there are multiple authors in whatever block of code I selected, it would @mention multiple people. So now not only is it easier for me to ask the question, it automatically gets routed to the right person. So think about the impact on a junior developer, somebody who's just joined the team and has a lot of questions about the code. Well, today, they just basically tap the team lead on the shoulder 15 times a day, and it gets really annoying. Well, with something like CodeStream, the question gets automatically routed to the correct developer, whoever's best answered the question, and that can just be handled via asynchronous chat. So that's the simplest example. I'd like to show you something a little bit more sophisticated. In this case, Larry is posting a message to the team. So Larry is a senior developer on our team, and he came across some code that he wanted to improve. And he says, you know what, variables like this should typically be declared as constants. And he includes a code block that represents the change he wants to make. Now, of course, Larry could have made this change himself. He could have just made the change, committed it, pushed it, and that would have been fine. But what he wants to do instead is he wants to share this important information with the whole team to increase all of our knowledge, make us all smarter about how to write better code, and presumably for this code base. Now, the way that Larry created that message is exactly the same way that I created this question, which is, although Larry made a change first. So for example, if I add some new code, then I can just select it and comment on it. And that's how Larry created that message. Now for me, because I'm seeing the message, I want to find out more about this. So all I have to do is click on it. And CodeStream will take me to the right file, scroll me to the right position within the file, select the block of code that he was referring to, and give me the ability to take action on it. So for example, I might want to see a diff. And so I can just click on the Show Diff button, and now I get a visual representation of the code that I have in my version and the locally modified version that Larry shared. But I can also just talk to him. So let's say, for example, I want to ask him, I get what you want to change, but why should I make that change? And Larry can just reply in real time. And if you think about what we've been doing so far without CodeStream, is that this conversation would require so much friction, it probably would never happen. But even so, I'd still have to go back and tell Larry, yeah, this change in that file, in this repository, in this line, what can you explain to me why it works? But because not only is the context preserved around the file, but even in this thread, we're talking about a specific change that Larry wants to make. It's just super simple, right? So Larry's convinced me that it's going to avoid a bug down the road, so I can go ahead and apply that patch. If you look closely, you'll see that I've incorporated his change into my code, and it'll be part of my next commit. So that's how easy it is to exchange snippets of code. You can think of a lot of different scenarios where this could be helpful. One of them would be, for example, I'm a junior developer, and I've run into a brick wall. I've got a syntax error, and I can't figure it out. Well, with CodeStream, all I have to do is select that code, type, can somebody help? And one of my teammates can send me a one-line patch. Maybe I had a colon instead of a semicolon or something silly like that. And I click apply patch, and I'm back in business. So there are a number of different scenarios where you can see that just being able to easily share snippets of code would be beneficial. And then the great part about how to preserve all of this knowledge forever is that you may have noticed that right to the left here of this code block that we were referring to, we've left an image, a conversation annotation there, an annotation marker. Now, why is that there? Well, it's for the future me. It's for when I come back a year from now and I'm looking at this code and I forget why we changed those variables to constant. Or maybe I'm a new developer on the team looking at this code for the first time and I'm trying to scratch my head and thinking about this code, why does it work this way? Well, I can see this annotation marker, and just by clicking on it, it'll take me back to that conversation thread and recall that exchange that Larry and I had, which described exactly why we made this change. So this goes back to that example of when you change that constant from 60 seconds to 120, it's super easy to just document it in chat and say, select that part of the code, say, hey, this is where we're going to make a change. Is everybody cool with that? Your teammate responds, yep, go ahead. And now that's forever going to be linked. And what's really great about the way this works is that this annotation marker will stay forever tied to that block of code, even as our code evolves. So even as new code is added above it, even if this code block gets cut and pasted to a different part of the file, or even into a different file. And it even works across branches. So if Larry, for example, is on one branch, I'm on a different branch, well, the same block of code for us might appear at different places in the file. And CodeStream's able to figure all of that out and sync it all up. So with that, I'd love to give everybody an opportunity to ask questions or share a story about how they think that talking more about code could help their development process. And if you're interested in a deeper dive into the demo, obviously come check us out in the exhibitors hall. So I'll pause there for any questions.
You already mentioned how you would get around talk about turnover when they ask the person, they do a GitHub lookup and that person's no longer here or no longer on the team. Like, how do you route that question to someone else?
Very cool question. So let's say, for example, in this first interaction where I had a question about this function and the system automatically mentioned Colin Stryker. Well, what if Colin left the team? So one of the cool things is that CodeStream allows you to manage the membership. So you let us know that Colin's no longer there, and then you let us know that George has taken over for Colin. And so we'll map that. Now George will get @mention instead of Colin in any instance that Colin would have been @mentioned.
Any options for voice plugins to those conversations?
No, but actually one of the things that we're really excited about is with our VS Code, so no voice, but that's down the road. It's on the roadmap. But what some people have been asking for is anybody familiar with Live Share? Has anybody tried it? A couple of people. So Visual Studio and VS Code has this new feature called Live Share, which is essentially like screen sharing for developers. And it's pretty awesome. If you haven't checked it out, you should check it out. One of the cool features of it is that if I want to look at the work that you're doing, you just share with me, and my editor basically reflects what you're looking at, but I get to control it, so I can navigate through your source tree. And so your question sort of reminded me of the one missing piece to that is that we can't talk to each other. And so we're pretty excited that on May 7th, if anybody's going to be at the Build conference in Seattle, we'll be on stage with Microsoft announcing our integration with Live Share so you can share each other's code and talk about it. With
I have one question through the app, and then I'll come over there with the mic. Do you have any plans for IntelliJ?
Yeah, so our product roadmap is very editor-driven. First was Atom, VS Code's in May. IntelliJ family is going to be end of July, and then additional editors in the second half of the year. It's interesting for us who are developers. if you were building a messaging app today, you probably need to build an iOS version, an Android version, and a web, and maybe a desktop version. So you'd have to manage like 3 or 4 code bases to do that. We have a similar problem, but our clients are editors, not like OSs. So we have to build out CodeStream for a bunch of different editors. If anybody's an expert in IDE plugin development, come talk to me, and we're hiring.
Cool. One more question here for the app. How to handle vendor lock-in, or how do you handle vendor lock-in? Where is the data stored?
So the data is actually all on your laptop in plain text. So it moves encrypted, but when it's stored on your laptop, it's in a SQLite database and human readable. You can query it, you can do whatever you want. We do also store your messages in the cloud, so that when a new person joins their team, they can download the whole conversation history. So you can export it, you can do whatever you want with it.
Cool.
So talking into a bit of the Git revision history, obviously the change for the constants is probably going to be perpetual, but for other methods that undergo a lot of refactoring,
Yeah.
is there any way to handle when the discussions are no longer applicable to what they're talking about?
Yeah, that's a great observation, which is that this sometimes we all know how chat works, right? Sometimes it's super valuable to save that and save it for a long time, but other times it's kind of like throwaway. And so our model is that the mainline chat, which is sort of ephemeral, but when you're talking about code, we add these annotation markers which link you back to those threads. But you can unpin an annotation marker, in which case it sort of disappears, and then it only exists in the main line.
So kind of the workflow would be that if you're making the change that makes that discussion no longer applicable to...
Yeah, then you unpin, yeah, exactly.
Here first.
Well, I had more or less the same question, but I do have another question. Is it able to track like file renaming and things like that? Because sometimes in Git, if you rename a file, then it almost becomes, whatever diff there was there before, it just vanishes because now it's essentially a new file.
Our goal is to be able to track 100% of all the different things you can do to your code base and make all the conversations line up perfectly to what they were referring to. There are some extreme scenarios where you can trick our algorithm if you really try hard, but file renaming is one of the things we support.
Do you support like an on-prem Git, or does it have to be GitHub in the cloud?
Any flavor of Git will work because the only interaction we have with Git is whatever your computer is using, the Git client on your computer. The other question that's sometimes asked, is there an on-prem version of our service? And the answer is unfortunately no. Not yet. We'll see if the market demands it, and if it does, we'll build it. But I think Slack has shown that you can build a messaging service without on-prem and be pretty successful. So we'll see.
Any more questions?
What are the search capabilities of these? If I want to search regardless to code base.
Today, there is no search. It's one of the most requested features on our roadmap. So once we get some additional editor coverage, it's high on our priority list. The cool thing is, if you think what you could do with search, I think it's a pretty neat concept to be able to search the discussion around your code and your code base at the same time, because we'll surface results from both. Because sometimes you might remember you talked about a function, but you don't remember the name of the function, and so you can recall it through that way. So we see, and also just being able to search for things like commit IDs and branch names and things like that. So a true unified search of your code base and the discussion around it. One of the things I didn't really get to in the demo is, in addition to just human discussion around your code base, we also have plans to integrate with third-party apps in the same way that something like Slack does. So why would you want to do that? Well, the reason is Slack doesn't know anything about your code base. So for example, if you have a process in production that dies and you're using a crash reporting tool, probably ping Slack today and you get notified of it. That's cool. But by putting a messaging platform in your IDE, well, when it pings CodeStream, it can take you right to the line of the file where it crashed. So you can just click on it and go right there, and provide a running history of your crashes related to the areas of your code that are problematic. So our long-term aim is to be the messaging platform for your code base. So you can plug all of your developer tools into it and have one sort of mission control view of your code in the same way that you use Slack for non-developer businesses.
I had similar question. So for code contextual, this is really great. But for business context, say we are using JIRA and we have ticket number. I really want my product owner to know this is changing. Would this work?
Well, our plan is to be the messaging platform for developers. So to the extent that we have extensions with, well, let me answer it two ways. We do plan to have JIRA support, JIRA integration. And so you'll be able to, as a developer, you'll be able to interact with JIRA. What we are unlikely to ever add to CodeStream is like project management tools. Like, we don't want to be the tool to deliver every aspect of software. We want to focus very strongly on the developer experience. The people who write code should have tools to make it easy to talk about writing code.
Okay, and one more question. So we also have JavaScript file that are 6,000 lines long. Don't judge me. When we refactor, we might actually make multiple files out of them.
Yeah.
And when that happens, would we be able to take this conversation and put them on those files that are, and just if we delete the original file, would we still be able to preserve?
So that's one of those cases where I said, like, we could support it. If you try to break it, you probably will figure out a scenario where you can try to break the model, but out of the box, it should do that. Because when you copy and paste or cut and paste those blocks of code into the new files, we do track that as part of a commit. So that should work. And I don't judge you. We've got the same thing.
Any more questions?
Is all of that tracking being done within the IDE itself? I mean, if there's an developer that's not using that IDE, are they gonna mess things up?
The answer to your question, are they going to mess it up? No, they're not going to mess it up. All the tracking is actually done, the technical implementation is actually in Go, and it runs as a little daemon on your computer, rather than having to rewrite that implementation, because that's the hardest thing about what we're delivering. We try to make it look very simple in the front end, but the algorithm to track what conversations point to what parts of code across branches and as your code base evolves is actually super complex. And that's written in Go, and it runs as a daemon on your computer. And basically what we do is we just track with every message you add to the stream, we track all the metadata that we need in order to be able to recreate the UX around it. So it tracks what your commit ID was at the time, what branch you're on, whether you locally modified, how you would locally modify the file. All that information we need to be able to recreate things later. So some people say, such a simple idea, why hasn't anybody built this yet? And I think once we got into it, we understood why, because it's actually a pretty hard problem to solve.
Cool, well, I think we're almost out of time.
Great.
There's 1 minute on the clock, so if there's one really important question someone wants to ask. Otherwise, thank you very much, Peter.
Awesome. Thanks, guys. Thanks, everyone.